has been something that has been an evolution that's kind of come and gone and is coming back. The supply chain, and I'm going to talk about several different periods here, pre-2016. And if I really wanted to, I could go back to the early 1990s. That's the last one. I just, wanted to mention that with the evolution of the NAFTA agreement back in the early 1990s, there was a lot of nearshoring in Mexico for a lot of multinationals for shipping to the U.S. Then suddenly, as costs rose and in Mexico and other local closer countries, and prices started going down, or expenses started going down in Asia, things started moving offshore rather than closer to the U.S. And then here are on my slide, and we'll go to the next slide. I'll mention that prior to 2016, I'm going to talk, and then these dates that I'm using really are some milestones with respect to trade barriers in the U.S., which has really greatly affected the supply chain. So it was essentially very much an offshoring situation up until just the past 5 or 6 years. Here I'm showing trade flows directly from China into the U.S. for distribution into the U.S. I have several places, Suzhou, Xinjiang, and Guangzhou in China. Production, those are just several examples of Chinese sources that were have been very popular because of quality of the products that are manufactured, obviously price, and also being close to a lot of raw material. Not only focusing on China, but also a lot of other areas as well. For the apparel industry, increasingly Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, other countries, obviously Vietnam and Malaysia. But China really, I think, came out in the lead up until about 2016, 2017, because of all the factors that I just mentioned. So if we'll move forward to the next slide, with our previous president, President Trump, he instituted what are called the Section 301 tariffs in the U.S. And these tariffs were widely applied to many goods manufactured in China, up to about 25% of the value of the goods coming in. So as you can imagine, when you increase your bottom line by 25%, there's a panic, and there has been a panic. And because of that, in 2017 and thereafter, companies were trying to move their supply chain, not completely out of China, but trying to find alternate supply chains. So manufacturing operations would move to Vietnam, they would move to Malaysia, they would move to other countries close by in Asia, but a lot of the inputs continued to be from China. So with that, companies were trying to change the origin of the finished goods so that those 25% duties would not apply. With that came a lot of scrutiny from U.S. Customs because there was circumvention allegations. Companies were circumventing things by just relabeling the goods that they were actually manufactured fully in China, and a substantial transformation had not occurred outside of China. We go to the next slide, just showing visually what those trade flows look like. You would often have goods going from China, from mainland China, and in this example, to Vietnam. You saw a lot of electronics, a lot of consumer products undergoing the final assembly in Vietnam with a fair amount of Chinese input. And then those goods would go on to Los Angeles, in this example, for distribution through the U.S. And you also had a lot of Chinese goods, parts and components, going to Mexico. And Mexico has been an important trade partner, one of the most important trade partners with the U.S. through the years with their, traditionally their maquila industry, now called the INEX program, which Ricardo is going to talk about. But the assembly of those Chinese and other non-U.S. parts and components in Mexico for production to the U.S. market. So those Section 301 tariffs significantly changed what was going on so that you could get the origin of the product outside of China, perhaps Vietnam, perhaps Mexico, other countries as well, to avoid those tariffs. So if we fast forward to just last year, there was new legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA, and this, which was implemented in June 2022, and this targeted goods that were made in whole or in part in the Xinjiang region of China or by certain Chinese entities using Uyghur labor. Just very briefly on that point, any good input or any article that is manufactured in the Xinjiang region or that is made by and has a connection to a sanctioned Chinese party that's been recognized as using the Uyghur forced labor, U.S. Customs presumes that those goods are made with forced labor. And so right now in the U.S., it's a huge issue in that these goods are being detained by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and there is a huge burden on the importer to provide supply chain documentation to demonstrate that there is no connection with the Xinjiang region, which is really quite difficult because of going back and tracing by lot number, by a unique identifying number, all the raw materials back to, if it's a metal, to where it was mined, where it was smelted. In the solar industry, you've got to trace back to where the silica was mined. If you have wearing apparel, you have to go back to where the cotton was grown. And Xinjiang was one of the major, is one of the major regions growing cotton. In fact, it provides 80% of all cotton grown in China. So with this and these detentions and the increasing enforcement in the U.S., companies are once again that supply the U.S. market are trying to figure out what do we do now. We've already moved some of our finishing operations outside of China, but now even if we manufacture our shirts and garments in Vietnam, if any of the inputs come from China, we could be subject to the UFLPA and the goods could be detained at entry. So now companies are moving production away from China and closer to home. And if we go to the next slide, I've got some examples here of what's happening. And I think countries like Mexico, Colombia is another example. Our good friend Jose down in Colombia. But today we're going to talk about with Ricardo, Mexico, because we're seeing, I mean, traditionally we've seen a lot of Chinese inputs going into Mexico for the finished assembly operations. But increasingly, companies are trying to find other sources for those parts and components and sub-assemblies from India, from Vietnam, from South Korea. Those goods are being shipped to Mexico. Sometimes the logistics are such, they go to Los Angeles and then are moved down in bond, or perhaps go directly to Mexico. But then those operations that happen down in Mexico are going to result in goods that are made potentially with very little, if any, Chinese origin, because of these trade barriers that have been imposed. So we're seeing a lot of shifting of the supply chains there. One other thing that I'll mention is we're starting to see additional production in the United States. Of course, the labor rates are much higher than they are in most of Asia, and probably all of Asia, and especially China. But with that, in certain industries, they can manage to do that. There is the Made in USA campaign, a marketing campaign, where if goods are all or virtually all produced in the U.S. with U.S. input, there is some advantage from a marketing standpoint in certain industries. Having said that, however, at the end of the day, price often is the driving factor. So with that, I think we'll start the conversation with our Mexican colleague here, Ricardo.
Yeah, thank you, David. Before that, before we started with our camera on, or live on, we were discussing and you were commenting that for Section 301, there's no minimum, the minimum. So you have to demonstrate 100% of your components, that the traceability of 100% of them.
And that's for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Yeah.
That is a 100%, I mean, there's no de minimis. So if you have a machine that has a screw in it that originated in the Xinjiang region and you can't trace that back and prove that it did not come from that region, then you have a problem. Now, the Section 301 tariffs, they aren't quite as strict because you can have Chinese input, but those Chinese inputs have to be what's called substantially transformed. Say in Mexico into a different article of commerce that would change the origin and therefore would not be a product of China and not subject to those tariffs.
Have you seen any client with the capabilities of demonstrate 100% of the production? Because if there's no de minimis, that means that 0.005% is a problem.
Well, the detentions in the U.S. started in probably July, August of last year. There have actually not been as many detentions as we thought there would be, but they're increasing substantially each month. We have seen a very small number of goods released from customs. The vast majority are being excluded from entry into the U.S. But customs says that the supply chain documentation is not sufficient. But they will not tell you where it's not sufficient. And so therefore, it's a really difficult standard to meet. So companies are really trying, and in that case, they're talking to their suppliers, say in Mexico, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, and in other countries, and they're saying, please don't source any inputs from China because they get commingled, and you can't prove at the end of the day to customs that there's no Xinjiang inputs, and therefore the goods are at risk of being detained.
You were telling us about the TVP taking detention in shipments. How about post-importation audits? Do they look for that, or is only at the moment of importation?
For customs, under the two statutes that are in place, it's at the time of importation that can block the entry of those goods under Section 1307 of the Tariff Act and the UFLPA. But there's another law there that makes it really difficult as well, in that both a company is both civilly and potentially criminally liable if they sell goods that were made with forced labor. So if a company imports goods, and there actually is a case pending right now against a medical supply company that imported rubber gloves prior to the import ban. They had those rubber gloves in their inventory. They came in legally, but now there's a class action lawsuit against representing the workers of that factory, claiming that the U.S. importer has profited off of the use of forced labor. So there's a lot of liability associated with that, and potentially the Justice Department, there can be criminal liability in certain circumstances. We haven't seen the criminal side of that yet, although we do see it in human trafficking. But with respect to the goods we're talking about today, that's something that's out there. But certainly these class action lawsuits are starting to increase.
Well, that's real relevant information. And Ricardo Romero from Cheve, Mexico. Mexico is, if not the biggest, one big trade partner with the U.S. Necessarily onshoring, offshoring, onshoring, because we have lived that in the country. How is the vision? How is the Mexican perspective about the whole problem attached to the number one client?
Well, I think this trend initiated like a couple of years ago. It is really benefited. It is a benefit for Mexico because, as Cristina just mentioned, COVID exposed all of the supply chain problems of sourcing everything in one place, and that place being, unfortunately, Asia. And with all this, the costs of the transport raising up, and the trade barriers that just were explained by David, makes Mexico really attractive because we have the USMCA. And at least for 301, for Section 301, if you undertake any manufacturing or substantial transformation of the raw materials or inputs into a different or a final product, which qualifies as Mexico originated for USMCA purposes, you are allowed to import them without tariffs into the U.S. So I think those key factors, and of course the previous experience that Mexico already have as a manufacturing hub of several type of industries. You also know it, electrical industries, electronic, auto parts, automobile, home appliances, chemical. There are a lot of textile. Yeah, there are a lot of industries which they have expertise. They have labor expertise. They have tech guys who are specialized in that, and that is really appreciated by the foreign companies which are looking back into Mexico and reinvest and moving back investments, which they could take out some years ago, and because of all of these issues, it makes sense moving them back to Mexico. And of course, there's also additional customs and tax benefits which were in place several years ago. For example, the Maquila or the IMEX program, which is an export program created a long time ago by the Mexican government, which precisely the main thing is to boost manufacturing in Mexico, that it is destined to a foreign market. So I think we have been talking on several GLCA webinars and sessions about the IMEX program, but just to make a quick reminder of that, it's an export program, a benefit that is created by the Mexican government. It has several modalities, being the most important or common one, the industrial modality, wherever you get some physical or tangible inputs and you transform them into a finished product. But we also have the services modality, where you can set up, for example, a service company in Mexico in order to provide services to foreign entities, like the call centers or the banking, sourcing, the back office administrative issues that could be useful for a lot of international companies whenever they are seeking to pay not too much labor costs on that, and getting prepared tech guys in order to do so. So I think this is more or less the background and the reality of this program, and precisely the customs benefit regarding the industrial modality would be you're allowed to temporarily import raw materials without paying import duties, and of course assets and equipment, since the WTO restriction, and we have since NAFTA another restriction. We're not allowed to import duty-free equipment that is used in this type of deferral programs in terms of NAFTA and now the USMCA. But VAT, for example, if you get a special certification from the tax authorities, you're allowed to import on a temporary basis the raw materials and the inputs, and also the equipment without disbursing or paying the VAT. It is not an exemption because the tax authorities will grant you a credit, and you will have to have a control of that credit through several administrative requirements and burdens. And that is something that it has been criticized about this program. But if you measure the benefit versus the administrative cost of not having that cash flow effect in your operation, I think 99.9% of the companies decides to go and get that certification before the tax authorities versus getting the cash out of the companies and paying to the Mexican government, and then stalling that money 6 to 8 or months or even a year before they could get the refund back of it. So I think it makes sense to do that. And the thing is, as I mentioned in my past panel, Mexico tax environment is really the tax authorities are very aggressive in collecting and doing. In order to do so, they are auditing this type of companies through the VAT certification. Whenever you lose that VAT certification or it expires and you will fail to renew it, then a obligation of payment pops up on the screen, and you are obliged to pay precisely that credit which you were granted. So things could get complicated if you don't have the right tools to manage properly your IMEX program in Mexico. And well, just to mention other benefits of this type of program in Mexico.
Let me interrupt you.
Yes.
So you're saying that not only the import duty, but value-added tax, VAT,
Yeah.
is a big issue that could be resolved through the duty referral program, IMEX.
Yeah.
And the consideration or the main recommendation that you can do at a company is to follow those programs, to obtain those programs, because paying VAT, value-added tax, and requested a refund.
It's a nightmare.
Okay.
It's a nightmare.
You
Yeah,
say
it's a
that.
nightmare.
Thank you.
And the other tax-related benefits, I think the most important is regarding the income tax, which it provides a what we call an umbrella protection, an extra protection for the permanent establishment issue. Normally, the way this structure operates within Mexico is that there's a international parent company who has a subsidiary in Mexico who's making the maquila process or the manufacturing process. And in order to avoid any income tax discussion or where it could be taxed or that international company could be taxed in Mexico or not, this in the law is established or provided. This is special relief for the permanent establishment to the parent company of the maquila, as long as, of course, you fulfill several requirements in order to allocate some of the income to that maquila entity through the safe harbor rules, which it is common now to be determined either 6.9 of the value of the asset used in the maquila operation or 6.5% of the operating costs and expenses incurred in maquila service. And as long as, of course, it is the company, the Mexican maquila company, is dedicated precisely to rendering this maquila service, which implies also that only or more than not mainly the income that they receive through that company, the Mexican company, is related only to the maquila service. If you receive more than 10% of the income, that is, you have at least to have 90% of the income for the maquila service. If you receive more than 10% of an income for an additional activity, you will not have this income tax benefit. And you have to export 100% of what is manufactured. Remember, in Mexico, we have this virtual exportation operations. So whenever a maquila or any temporary import something, transform it, the finished good is considered still on a temporary customs regime. And then you transfer that to another maquila entity through virtual customs operation. And that exportation, that virtual exportation, considered an exportation for the income tax benefit. So as long as you export either physically or virtually, the 100% of the finished products, you will be compliant with this. And of course, the last requirement is you have to at least be, or the parent international company at least has to be the property or the owner of the 30% of the equipment and the assets that are used in the maquila in order to be considered as a maquila operation for income tax purposes. If you don't fulfill and you have only 25% or the parent company has only 20% of the equipment and the assets, this requirement or this benefit is not granted. So the permanent established issue will be in danger or risk for the parent company or the international company. In order to avoid this, you should fulfill with these obligations. And I think in order to close up on the Mexican part, in this slide I just share some nearshoring examples in the last couple of years of, for example, Swiss companies, ABB, Franke, Dormakaba, ABB with a low voltage motor business in 2022, Franke, the new production facility kitchen systems in 2022. So this demonstrates that this nearshoring is happening. Credit Suisse reports in December 2022 that it was around, if I remember, $30,000 million of investing in the nearshoring going back to Mexico. So we have been hearing a lot of similar cases. Tesla, the early announcement of the Gigafactory in the northern part of Mexico, BMW, which also announced an 800 million euro investment as a expansion of its plant in San Luis Potosí. It is a fact that this is happening, and they are taking advantage of this precise export programs in order to do so.
And probably that impacts in the, now we have the super peso, no, and exchange rate is a little bit
Overrated.
overboosted. Yeah.
Overrated.
Okay, yeah.
No, but I'm not a economical expert, but something told me that that's a fiction, so I don't know.
Okay, good. I have some questions for you guys. One of them is listening Christina and David remind me the inflation situation, that is not the same cause the inflation in Europe that the inflation in the U.S. for different reasons, one or to the other. And what I can see here is also that the rationale for the onshoring in Switzerland, is a little bit different from the U.S. It looks like we're still having not only global situation applicable for every country, but we have our differences. Would you like to add something, to comment something on it?
I think for nearshoring, the inflation is a factor, as I mentioned in one of the pillars. Switzerland is compared to the European countries around, still have a quite considerable low inflation, but this is only one factor, and as I mentioned, the most important factor for the nearshoring index was the labor costs and the availability of skilled people. So these are the main factors for nearshoring.
And I think it's probably the same in the U.S. Certainly, inflation is a factor. You know, one thing we didn't mention, but that's increasingly becoming important, are the ESG concerns. You know, it's easier to maybe have a handle on what's going on in Mexico because you have more access to the factories and to the inputs that are sourced from there, and the producers, as opposed to trying to monitor what's going on in China or some other country in Asia or elsewhere around the world. So I think that's another factor that's becoming very important, and certainly from what we heard earlier about the carbon tax, a lot of other considerations are coming into it. But I think it all goes into makes up the pie that we have to deal with.
Yeah, and for the Mexican part, I think inflation, surprisingly, something that has been managed somehow in a good manner. We have a similar inflation in the U.S. Surprisingly, once again, between 7% and 8%. So I think it's not that. I think what the companies are looking at is precisely the skill of the labor force and of course that the cost of transportation.
Transportation is very important.
Exactly.
Because it's usually 28 days or more, sometimes on the water from Asia into the west coast of the U.S. And if you have the flexibility of just shipping, trucking goods up from the Mexican border, it gives you much more flexibility.
Production flexibility could be as well.
That's right.
I mean, in China, how long you need, changing color, size, or whatever, but you have asked for it, probably you have to wait a lot. So they change, and in Mexico or near shoring, you can decide with more frequent, let's say, monthly basis or whatever, that you have, because the market is requesting different products for different size, different colors.
Yeah. I actually, I think, moving forward, because things are so dynamic and they change very often, I think multinationals are very wise to look at a variety of alternative supply chains. Are they going to get completely out of China? Probably not. There's too much there, but increasingly the cost of doing business is going up, even though the labor rates are, say, much lower than in the U.S. and perhaps Mexico and other countries. but then again, it's all a cost benefit analysis, and I think you have to have those alternative supply chains like in Mexico, where, it has other advantages that Asia and China don't have. So, you can't put all of your eggs in one basket these days.
Okay, I would like to pose another question to the panel. Feel free to answer. And it occurs to me, does it have any emotional or overreaction component since grain war has something to do with it, or is just simple and pure economical decision?
You want to go first?
Well, I can only again refer to the 5 pillars and the cultural component, the language proximity is, I think, also a soft factor, but an important factor, which can, in the end, has determined, for example, the reverse of the offshoring by UBS back to Switzerland, just the proximity, and also to have the lower reaction time. So I think there are soft factors are quite important nowadays. It's not only about cost.
And I think the same in the U.S. Certainly, you go back a couple of decades and something made that was marked made in Vietnam was something that probably wasn't sellable because the Vietnam War was too recent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that stigma has gone away, and from a political situation in the U.S., China is seen as, a stark competitor and perhaps an enemy economically and perhaps otherwise, the way, based on what's happening with the trade barrier. So there is some advantage for not having to mark a good made in China. Companies are very sensitive as to, depending on the product, whether there's a marketing advantage for it to say made in Mexico as opposed or made in the U.S. Our friend and colleague Roy Delbeck out of Hong Kong sent us, shared an article with us about the textile industry in Ireland. What are the benefits of saying made in Ireland? And certainly for a lot of high cost goods, Irish linen, for example, there's a true benefit from a marketing aspect on that. Again, at the end of the day, you do have costs which go into that. But, I don't think any one factor is determinative, but they certainly have an impact.
Yeah. Yeah, from the Mexican perspective, I think that the Ukraine war, of course, it's a really, really awful situation, but it mainly could impact the goods that could be traded between those countries, Mexico and Ukraine. Maybe the grains.
How about political situation in Mexico? It looks like demonstrations, big demonstrations.
Making examples.
Yeah. Does it have impact in foreign investors at the time, or are they running away from China? They say, well, at least Mexico for now, but not definitely. What would be your view?
I think the political environment is really important in an investment. In the Mexico case, this government has been really elastic in giving certainty to the investors, and we can see some examples. The beer factory, the Constellation branch issue, what happened to what's supposed to be the new airport of nearby Mexico City, which got canceled, and several other oil and gas controversies that were recently resolved by the Mexican Federal Electric Company. Those things doesn't help investors taking the decision. It does not make the decision easy for them. So in order to help them, I think Mexico has a huge opportunity, a huge window opportunity now at this moment. And if we don't seize that opportunity, we will be crying in a couple of years that we didn't seize that opportunity and have a really, really good moment trying to attract more investing, only because we have a government that it is not decisive or doesn't want to engage with what the benefits of investing makes to the people and to a country, about creating jobs, making a skilled labor force, and once again, if you have all of this uncertainty, investors, the first requirement certainty. The other thing is security. Security is still an issue in Mexico, and as long as we don't establish clear actions in order to give certainty on those things, I think this nearshoring trend will not be 100% favored to Mexico.
Okay, I'd like to pose the final question and stop torturing you guys about when NAFTA at that time entered into force. U.S. investment in Mexico was tremendous, so opened thousands of maquilas, and later on appeared China competitive. Do you think that offshoring was miscalculation, was underestimated in the long term? My point is, was moving factories or moving production, even in the U.S. and Mexico and other jurisdictions, to China, was an immediate response to reduce costs instead of a long-term corporate policy, manufacturing policy?
I'll start on that. I think politically in the U.S., it opened the floodgates. Up until that point, there was maybe not a stigma, but there was hesitancy to move offshore, even if it's just down to Mexico. But with the passing of NAFTA, it was seen as, it was not only politically viable because it passed, although it was somewhat controversial in the U.S. and certainly in Mexico, and Canada had their issues. But there were many stories of U.S. Workers training their Mexican counterparts who were going to be taking their jobs from them. And I think with that politically, companies could see, well, we could easily go to Mexico, but if we find that China or Vietnam or some other countries, South Korea's wages are even lower, then why not go there? And I think at the end of the day, it really made it much easier for companies, probably politically and internally to do that.
Christina, you wanna? And I think, I don't know if to call it miscalculation something correct, because of course the companies want to seek lower costs, and it seems in that moment that offshoring was the right move.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what should be analyzing is we should be reviewing numbers. If it really worked, offshoring versus what COVID shows us, depending on Asian ports being closed and open, and all this disruption in the supply chain issue. How much does it cost the companies, and if they how their P&L were impacted? And I think it's their trends, business and this kind of good supply chain and manufacturing businesses have trends, and I think we have to again seize the opportunity of the new show.
And one last comment. I think one of the arguments I go back to the debate between Al Gore and Ross Perot for the NAFTA back in 1992, 1993, and one of the arguments, political arguments, was, well, if we pass NAFTA and we shore up the political and economic situation in Mexico with new jobs, that's our neighbor. That's going to help with illegal immigration, and it's going to help our neighbor, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's going to help the U.S. So you can't lose sight of the political situation there, as opposed to maybe helping China, which is now perceived as maybe not as friendly as it was some years ago. Mm-hmm. And those political situations change. I think it was overall a good thing, NAFTA, maybe not as good as a lot of people have said, or have posed, but again, I think it all plays into, helping your neighbors close by, which will help yourself.
Good. I want to thank you, Cristina. I want to thank you, David. I want to thank you, Ricardo, because you guys did an outstanding job. And also, I take the opportunity to thank all the audience. We have people from Australia, Far East, and I know it's pretty late there, and they have been following through online presentation. We have people from the Americas, Europe, of course, and the rest of Asia. So really appreciate your company, virtual company, but your company. And we'll see you soon in the following events organized by the Global Legal Customs Association. Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, good night, depending upon your. Thank you.
Thanks,